Well, I'm available to start at right tackle.
You can't see when I have clothes on.
All right. Well, there's not an even playing field. There's never been an even playing field. There never will be an even playing field.
What shampoo do you use on your hair?
You don't need to be Superman to play in this offense.
You're listening to The Red Zone.
Welcome, Badgers fans, to another episode of The Red Zone. I'm your host, Jason Galloway, with the Wisconsin State Journal, back for a postseason mailbag here. The regular season ended on Saturday against Minnesota. We don't have our regular podcast schedule this week, but I did want to throw a mailbag out there so you guys could get some more of your questions in. I know I did a live chat on Saturday night, and a lot of people's questions got passed over because there was a lot of people in there. So I already asked for your questions on Twitter, though, and I got a lot of responses. So let's go ahead and get right into them. The first one is from Scott Schugel at Schugel. He says, do you honestly think next season we will see an open competition at the quarterback spot? Jonathan Taylor fumbles and he's pulled from games. Quarterbacks make mistakes and they stay in. As far as the second part of that, I think it's a little bit different. Obviously when Jonathan Taylor fumbles, every once in a while they leave him out for a series, but then he's right back in there. It's not like they're pulling him for the rest of games for a fumble. And again, Taylor's not going to be able to be out there every play anyway. He's going to need some rest. So I understand what you're saying, though, like you're giving some sort of punishment for Taylor fumbling. But I think a quarterback change is kind of a bigger deal than that. I think it's just kind of hard to compare those two things. But as far as a quarterback or a competition on the quarterback spot, I think we definitely could see it now. People don't like to hear this, but right now, Hornibrook is probably the best quarterback on the roster, the guy that gives you the best chance. I know Jack Cohn played well against Purdue, but it's easy to forget, how bad his previous two starts were before that. So I think coming into the next offseason, we'll see if Cohn makes another step. Obviously, Graham Mertz comes on campus, and we'll see if he's ready right away. So I think there could be a quarterback competition. I definitely wouldn't rule it out. I don't think Hornibrook or anybody else has played well enough at quarterback where you can say there's definitely not going to be a competition. I think it would be. Now again, I mentioned this on last week's mailbag too. I think they're going to avoid saying there's a competition at any spot really, especially quarterback in the spring. I think the coaching staff likes to make spring practice about improvement for individual players, and I don't think they're going to talk about competitions there, whether it's quarterback or otherwise, very often. So we may not know right away. Now, obviously, we need to kind of see what Graham Mertz looks like in the spring as well, see what kind of progress, Chase Wolf has made, if any. But I think the spring, it may be kind of hard to tell kind of what their plan is in that regard. Now, obviously, they're going to have to give a certain amount of reps to people, and if that will probably be kind of telling is when they finally get to sort of team drills during spring practice is, how many reps is Cohn getting with the first team offense, or is Hornibrook taking all of them, or is Graham Mertz getting many reps right away in spring ball at all? So I think that's going to be something it's definitely going to be something to keep an eye on. I definitely would not rule out a quarterback competition in the offseason. It's going to be a matter of somebody else, whether it's Jack Cohn or Graham Mertz or Chase Wolf, kind of stepping forward and making sure that they can push Hornibrook. And obviously Hornibrook has not been good this year, and that I understand people wanting there to be a quarterback competition, but some of those other guys have to step up too, and we'll kind of see if that happens come the offseason. I don't think it's a question we can really answer right now, but I think with the way the quarterback position is played for Wisconsin this year, you have to think that there's definitely a chance there could ultimately be a competition come fall camp. All right, Kevin at DC Badger 7 asks, are there any initial rumblings about staff changes? His team looked complacent much of the season. Perhaps bringing in a couple new voices might help. No, I haven't heard any rumblings about that, Kevin, as of right now. I've kind of talked about this before, but I think that they should probably, run it back again with this crew. And this is the same, for the most part, the same coaching staff that they took them to 2 top 10 finishes. And I think we need to put the season in perspective a little bit. It is a massively disappointing season, but it is 1 year, and I think that that there have been down years in the past for Wisconsin, and they've come back and perform well the next season. I think Brett Bielema, looking back at kind of his tenure. I think he had, I could be off a little bit on this, but I think he had a 7-6 year, and right before that run of 3 Rose Bowls. So this happens sometimes, and obviously I think you need to place blame where blame is, should be placed. But I also don't think it's time to just go around and start shaking up the staff when a lot of these guys did a really good job of developing some of these players throughout the last couple of years and played a big role in them finishing in the top 10 the last couple of seasons too. So I think you want to be careful about making too many changes or kind of resorting to that just because the season went poorly. I think maybe we need to kind of see how this team responds to this season. A lot of weird stuff happened this season with some of the injuries and spots they couldn't really afford, and the Quintez Cephas stuff maybe in hindsight was a distraction for this team. And obviously losing your best receiver is right before the season is not a positive thing either. So I think that I think you kind of need to keep everybody here, kind of regroup and see what you can figure out in the offseason going forward. I understand sort of the, wanting to shake things up a little bit if you're a fan of this team that have watched them underperform week in and week out here as the season has gone along. But I just think I would be hesitant to shake things up too much in that regard. All right, next one's Andy Stravers at AJ Stravs. He asks, Gophers fired their defensive coordinator after getting 55'd by Illinois. Isn't that offensive performance against Minnesota at least as bad and needs to be some accountability? Yeah, I don't think it was as bad as having Illinois score 55 against you. That's pretty bad. I mean, they gave up, I think it was more than 400 yards rushing against Illinois, and that was also sort of accumulation. That was sort of the final straw in that situation, I think. Minnesota had given up 30 or more than 30 points, I think, to every Big Ten team they had played up to that point, and that was sort of, you give up 55 to Illinois and however many, rushing yards it was. I can't remember the exact number, but I don't think Wisconsin's offensive performance kind of reached that level of low that Minnesota's defense did. And again, I think it was more of an accumulation thing. And obviously, you can say that Wisconsin's offense has been bad for a good while now, but I don't think it's quite time to, like I said, I guess this kind of goes back to the last question too. I mean, this is a team that, had been really successful for a number of years up until this year, and I wouldn't go, because of some of the mitigating circumstances, like I mentioned earlier. I don't think I would necessarily make wholesale changes or anything like that. I think you need to also remember that, you don't know how the new coaches are. If you did make coaching changes, who are you bringing in? And I don't think it's guaranteed to be better than what you have. And I think you have to be careful when, even though it has been disappointing, I think you have to be careful about kind of what you change in the offseason here. I think that obviously, like you said, there needs to be some accountability. Obviously, the season wasn't good enough, and the coaching staff is partly to blame for that. But again, I wouldn't, like I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't go make changes at this point. All right, Brian Kale at Kale_Brian says, I was looking at how the last of the Bielema recruits will be gone after this year, and the Anderson recruits will be finding their way out after next year. Has there been a dip in quality of recruits we are bringing in? I feel we will see another mediocre year next year. I don't see any of the 19 recruits making much of an impact next year, and the 20 class is looking promising, but will probably drop back down to normal rank around the 30s. How much of the success of Chris' first couple years were because of the players already there? I don't think the recruiting has dropped off at all. If you look at the recruiting rankings, it really hasn't dropped off, and I think this 19 class is actually looking really good with some of the guys they're bringing in and kind of where they're ranked right now compared to Wisconsin classes of the past. Now, again, it's not easy to recruit in Wisconsin. You're in a state that doesn't have a ton of high school talent, nor do the neighboring states. I mean, obviously there is some talent in Illinois, but it's just it's not super easy to recruit in Wisconsin as it would be for some of those teams in the South that, their in-state guys you're just filled with, 4 and 5 star guys in your own state. It's just a little bit more difficult, and I don't think they're doing any worse from a recruiting standpoint than they did under Gary Anderson or Brett Bielema or what have you. I mean, you look at some of the younger players in this team that have a ton of potential. I mean, They have a lot of offensive linemen that are young that you haven't seen yet that we've been hearing good things about and have a lot of potential. I mean, Jake Ferguson is going to be a star here. I know Danny Davis had a slow start to the season, but he's a guy that 4-star receiver that they plucked on National Signing Day a couple years ago and contributed quite a bit as a true freshman, and I think he's got a lot of potential to get better as well. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor was a guy that they, this staff found before anybody else and convinced him to come here from New Jersey. Now, while Quintez Cephas, obviously some different circumstances led to him not being with the team anymore, but he was a guy that Wisconsin was on before anybody else and turned out to be a really great player who probably has the talent to play at the next level. And that's just offensively. I mean, defensively, I think a lot of those young cornerbacks have a lot of potential to be really good players here. Now, they are young, obviously, and they made some, they had some bad games this year, and that's kind of expected for freshman defensive backs. But I think a lot of those guys have talent. I think Jack Sanborn's a guy that is going to step into his starting role next year. That they could be a really good player here. I mean, you can go on, and they've recruited a lot of talent. I think that this season wasn't really about that. I think they were young in some areas where they just probably couldn't afford to be. They got some injuries in some of the places they were thin at, and some groups didn't take the step forward you would hope on offense. The quarterback obviously didn't play well enough. The receiving group just wasn't playing well enough either, and so there were obviously some position groups that underperformed, but I don't think they have failed at bringing in talent in the last couple of recruiting classes or anything like that. I think there are a lot of guys that could turn out to be stars here that are still young. Let's see. Badger at Badger Beatdown asks, what is more likely to happen? Hornibrook grad transfers, Hornibrook retires due to concussions, or Chris has a legit open quarterback competition. I talked about this before, but the Hornibrook retiring thing, that's a personal choice for him, and he hasn't talked about his concussions yet, and so I'm not going to speculate on kind of what he's feeling in that regard. As far as the other two, whether he grad transfers or there's a legit open competition, I mean, obviously, like we talked about earlier, I think there's a better chance of an open quarterback competition. I mean, I think there has to be a quarterback competition before Hornibrook were to do a grad transfer, right? I mean, he's the number one quarterback right now. He's not going to just suddenly take a grad transfer when he's the number one guy. I think that there would have to be some sort of competition that he, I think something would have to happen in the spring where it looked like he wasn't going to be the guy for him to take that route maybe in the summer. So I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see him leaving. And again, I do think there's a chance there could be a quarterback competition this offseason. We just kind of have to wait and see how the reps are split up when we get to that point, and if any of the younger guys, whether it's Mertz or Wolf, can actually contribute to that competition, or if they're not quite ready yet. All right, Kiev at the Public Dog asks, is it time for an offense coordinator change? Is it possible to look into getting Darrell Bevel? I'll hit on that quickly just because we already talked about coaching changes, but I don't think it's time for that yet. And again, Paul Chris is your primary play caller, so I think if you're talking about making a change there, I don't know if that's going to change a whole lot about the offense if you changed the offensive coordinator. Now, obviously you could think about you could make the suggestion that maybe Paul Chris hands over play calling duties to somebody else, but I think it's a different discussion, and I don't know if that's necessary. I think the play calling, I think a lot of people have had complaints about the play calling. I think that's a little bit overblown. I think with the play of the quarterback position this year, I think Chris has been a little limited in what he feels like he can do. I don't think the play calling has necessarily been as bad as people are making it out to be. But if they did get a new offensive coordinator, I think Darrell Bevel definitely would be a good choice near the top of the list. I mean, a guy that's been an offensive coordinator for a number of years in the NFL now. So if they did want to make a change, I think Darrell Bevel would be a good guy to go after. Okay, Hugh Scallon at Badger Hugh. Who should have redshirted, who should not have redshirted, and then who should apply for the draft and who should not apply for the draft? As far as redshirts go, I'm never going to know as much about, kind of how they feel about their own players and their development as the coaching staff does, obviously. I was pretty puzzled by John Chenal not redshirting. I thought that looked like it was definitely going to happen, but he ended up playing. I think his fifth game was against Penn State, I think, and he's a guy that's only played on special teams. But that kind of leads you to think, well, maybe they think he's going to play a lot bigger role next year. They did that with Madison Cone when he was a true freshman last season. He didn't play a whole lot at cornerback. Here and there he did. But he played a lot on special teams because they knew he probably would play a bigger role the following season, and they thought it would be good for him to get the experience, even if a lot of it was on special teams. Maybe that's what's happening with Chanel, and maybe they're thinking he can compete for the starting fullback job next year. So I guess that's an explanation there. A lot of people are saying maybe Crookshank should have redshirted. You could argue that, I think, but he he's at least contributed some offensively. He's been your number one kickoff returner, even though he hasn't really broken a bunch of log ones. He was the number one guy in that role, and obviously they've used him on some jet sweeps. He caught his first pass the other day against Minnesota, so he maybe hasn't contributed as much as maybe you'd hope for a guy that's not redshirting. But I don't know if I would argue that he should have redshirted. So I think everybody else is understandable. I mean, Bryson Williams, you really needed him, and he's your starting nose guard right now. So obviously he was never going to redshirt. And then Wild Goose, of course, makes sense that he didn't redshirt him, and he was starting games here the second half of the year. As far as who redshirted that shouldn't have, I don't think there's anybody that I can think of that maybe they should have done that. I mean, I don't think there's really a guy. I think if a guy could have helped him this year, they would have played him. I think this coaching staff has been pretty. I think they've been pretty leaning toward not redshirting a guy if he can help them at all. I think that they look at that and say, if the guy can help us this year, we're going to play him. I think that's typically their philosophy. So I don't think there's anybody that redshirted that necessarily shouldn't have. Now, as far as applying for the draft, I think there's really only two guys with decisions here, with Tyler Biadasz and David Edwards, as far as underclassmen go. I think both of them could go and would be a decent draft selection. I think they both have a chance to be a day two guy. Now, I think both of them probably could possibly increase their draft stock by staying. I think with David Edwards mainly because of the injury. Obviously he had some poor games put on tape this year because of that injury. Now, of course, I think the NFL teams are going to know that he was injured, but it's sort of one of those things where it's kind of hard to evaluate him in that sense. So maybe it'd be better if he came back. I think with Biadasz, it's going to depend on sort of the feedback they get from the NFL. I mean, if Biadasz gets the feedback that he's going to be a second rounder, then I think he should go. Now, if he doesn't get that, I think it would benefit him to come back one more year, especially since he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining. So if something happens next year that really hurts him, whether it's a serious injury or just something happens where his stock goes down, he would at least have another year after that to kind of raise it back up if he needed to. So I guess that's kind of how I view that. I think it really depends on sort of the feedback they get from the league. All right, Kyle Rinke at Kyle_Rinke88 asks, what is their coaching staff going to do to prepare for their brutal schedule next year? Right now I see 8-4 season or worse. Looking at the schedule next year, there's going to be some tough games. Obviously, they got Michigan at home and they got at Ohio State. It's hard to see them winning those 2 games. Now they have Michigan State at home. That's not, you see that as your third crossover and think, that's a tough game. It may not be as tough as maybe you would normally see from Michigan. I mean, Michigan State was 7-5 this year as well. They obviously had a down year, and weren't really that as good as they probably hoped either. And I think you get that game at home, so that's a winnable game. Now, obviously, it's not going to be. I think Michigan State's going to be decent next year. It's not going to be an easy game, but obviously you'd rather play someone like Rutgers as your third crossover than Michigan State. So again, that's not going to be easy. Obviously, you got to go at Nebraska, a team that looks like they were really improving later on in the year. You get Iowa at home. And Purdue at home, so I don't know. It's going to be a tough one. Now their toughest non-conference game is at South Florida. I think maybe you're able to win that one instead of playing a team like Alabama or LSU, and maybe that helps a little bit. But I'm not going to make predictions for next season yet. I kind of want to see, what happens with this team in the offseason first. But I mean, I think 8-4 is definitely possible next year. I think maybe 9-3 is possible if they kind of get back to. I mean, there's only 2 games on the schedule if you look at them individually that I think they just can't see them winning with those Michigan and Ohio State games. But I think they're definitely going to be worse than. I do expect them to probably be worse than 10-2. I mean, it is a pretty difficult schedule, and the only way you can prepare for that really is just putting out the best team you can. I mean, you can't change the schedule, so I think you just have to kind of regroup and do the best you can to kind of get things back in line. And I think we all remember 2016 where it was a brutal schedule and we expected them to go 7-5 or 6-6, and they wouldn't have had a 10-2 year. And I don't think it's probably not going to happen next year, but I think that all you can do is put out the best team you can. Richard Carlson at RDK1212 asks, what is the structure and timing of postseason meetings with Barry Alvarez and Paul Chryst, and between Paul Chryst and the assistant coaches? Did any of the returning starters other than Jonathan Taylor play as well or better in 2018 as they played in 2017? As far as your first question, I mean, it'll just be after the bowl game. I'm sure it's sometime in January that they do performance reviews if they do that. So, again, like I said, I don't anticipate them making any changes. But if it did happen, I believe it would just be in January. The second part, I think there were some returning starters that played better. I mean, I think both inside linebackers, T.J. Edwards and Ryan Connolly, both continued to take steps forward. I thought Olivia Sangapolu, before he got injured, really took a big leap forward. I thought this was his best year by far as a senior. It's unfortunate that he got injured. And offensively, I think, I think a couple linemen. The offensive line has been under a lot of criticism this year. You kind of expected them to just dominate everybody in their path. It hasn't quite happened. I do think they've probably been better as a group than maybe most people would say. I'm kind of higher on them, on their performance this year than most people would be. Obviously, they still underperformed a little bit. They had some bad games, but I think Tyler Biadasz and Bo Benshaw both had better years this year than they did last year. I think both of them took a step up on the line. So I would say those two. And then I had one more offensive guy in my head when I looked at this earlier that I thought maybe took a step forward. Maybe that was it, though. I mean, obviously, with 10 returning starters offensively, you would like more than 3 guys to take a step forward. But that's difficult. But yeah, I think it wasn't just Taylor. I think there were at least a few other of those starters that were better or definitively better this year than they were last year. All right, SMG at Sean Geary 4. Who will be the fullback for the Badgers next season? Yeah, I mentioned John Chanel earlier as a guy, true freshman who didn't redshirt this year. That kind of indicates maybe he could compete for that job next year. I think it's either going to be him or Mason Stockey. Now, Mason Stockey is the number 2 fullback right now. He switched there from inside linebacker, a week or two before the season started, so he does not have a lot of experience there. Didn't get a lot of reps, but I think it's going to be between those two, unless there's somebody else I'm not don't foresee right now. Come spring ball, to be interesting to see which one, who's going to be there as a starting fullback with Engel gone for sure. All right, Badger Maniac at the Badger Maniac says, most of the discussion this season has been regarding the performance of the offense. Statistically, they may not have been what people hoped for, but their performance was similar to last year. The defensive drop-off has been more significant. With so many key losses, how concerned should we be moving forward? What are the prospects for taking a step to get back to at least partially to where we were? Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's important to keep in perspective. I think the offense definitely should have taken a bigger step forward, obviously. But the bigger drop off is with the defense, and that was sort of expected with losing 7 starters. But I think that it probably dropped off more than we anticipated. Now, as far as getting back to where they were, I mean, I don't think they're going to go into next year and suddenly be a top 10 defense in the country again. But I do think they're going to be better. You do lose a few key players. The inside linebackers stand out the most, obviously. Those were, I think, the 2 best players on the defense this year. It's not a situation like the defensive line, though, where the only thing you have left is a lot of freshmen who haven't played and a guy that switched from offense, a couple months before the season. I think they're going to have guys there. I mean, obviously, Chris Orr has been around a long time and has started games and is a good player. And he's going to start there along with, like I mentioned earlier, Jack Sanborn, I think, is the favorite to be there right now, and he's a guy that was one of their highest rated recruits in the 2018 class, I believe, and he's gotten some time this year to kind of get his feet wet, and I think he could be a really good player. Now, obviously, he's still going to be young next year and inexperienced, but it's not the same situation where you're replacing all those defensive linemen and you're throwing in, guys who haven't played. Walk-on redshirt freshman Matt Henningsen, a guy who was playing offensive line, and Caden Lyles. It's not going to be quite the same situation. So obviously that's a huge loss, but I think those guys can at least hold down the fort, I guess, at that position possibly. And of course, the guys in the secondary should take a step up. I like a lot of the potential of those young cornerbacks, like I've talked about before. Scott Nelson has had some kind of an up and down freshman year, but he should at least get better with another offseason ahead of him. You have some other safety. I think Reggie Pearson, we haven't seen a lot of him, but he showed a lot in that one game against Michigan that he started. I thought he played really well in that game, and maybe he could be a player for them. And Eric Burrell has kind of stepped in and been pretty good in a reserve role, having to start a few games this year. Of course, outside line, it's going to be hard to replace Andrew Van Ginkel, although he hasn't been 100% for a lot of the year. That's another concern, I think, along with inside linebackers, sort of the outside linebacker, like who, I think Bond has gotten a lot better throughout the year, and so I think he could take a step up next year. I think he could be good, but then it's like, who's going to step up? Is it going to be Tyler Johnson, who, hasn't really shown much this year? Is it going to be Christian Bell, who a lot of people were waiting for the past couple of years for him to kind of step up and play a bigger role? Or somebody else, maybe some of the younger guys we haven't seen yet. So I think they're going to need somebody, at least one or maybe two other guys, an outside linebacker that we aren't anticipating to kind of step up into that role. I think that would be big for them. And of course, the defensive line, getting Garrett Rand back is going to be huge. Hopefully Isaiah Loudermilk stays healthier. And Bryson Williams, I think, is going to be a good player in his second year. So hopefully you've developed a little bit more depth at that spot this year, playing a lot of those young guys. But I definitely expect them to take a step up defensively. I think there's some young talent over there on that side of the ball. Obviously, you're going to have some holes every year, but I think the holes you have to fill, especially at inside linebacker, they at least have a chance to put some talented players in there. All right, South Jersey Pete at S Jersey Pete. Not really a question, but am I the only person on the Chase Wolf bandwagon? It's funny. He's kind of a guy that's gotten forgotten a little bit with all the Graham Mertz hype. He's a guy that a lot of people were excited about coming in this past year, and a guy that has potential to be a good player. I think we have to kind of see how he develops. We haven't seen much of him, is the thing. He's a guy that didn't come in early last year, came in the fall, and we only get to see the first couple weeks of fall camp before practices are shut down for the rest of camp and for the season. So we've had basically 2 weeks of seeing Wolf where he's not getting a lot of reps either, because he's the third guy, or even the fourth guy actually. So that's going to be interesting to see kind of the progression he's made, and this is going to be his first spring ball coming up. Maybe he gets a little more reps there, and we get a little better look at him. So it's going to be interesting to see if he's kind of if he factors in at all. I think that's something to keep an eye on for sure. All right, the last couple here from RockWis711 at Palace_Rock. First one is, who is the quarterback coach, and just as important, who is most responsible for quarterback development? Hornibrook regressed significantly this year. Last year, he would overcome mistakes and go clutch and win games. John Bud Myers, the quarterback coach, and I think Paul Chris works with pretty closely with the quarterbacks as well. Again, Hornibrook has not had a good year. Clearly, you talk about him being clutch last year. Yeah, there were the Michigan game, the Miami game, maybe a couple more where he played really well down the stretch, and he did that in the Iowa game this year. I thought he was a big reason why they won that, but since that game, he just hasn't been able to find his rhythm. Obviously, he missed a few games there with the head injury, and again, he just hasn't been good enough this year, and I don't think the quarterback position it was a weakness for Wisconsin this year, and it definitely affected them a lot. Now, again, so I think you just kind of have to wait and see if that quarterback competition happens, and if those other guys can push Hornibrook. I think it's going to be interesting with kind of some of the recent recruits you have, and if Graham Mertz can come in and be everything that you kind of hope he is, and maybe he's not ready as a true freshman, but maybe he comes in and can really compete for the job as a redshirt freshman in 2020 and give you a lot more at that position. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how Hornibrook responds to this. Like I've said, I think I mentioned this on a radio interview earlier this week too, is it might be the best thing for Hornibrook for there to be a quarterback competition. I mean, I think the best is brought out in players a lot of times when they are, legitimately pushed and there are guys on their heels. I think I've seen that a lot from a lot of players in the past where, the last couple of years, I think fans have been calling for for Jack Cohn the last couple of years, but in reality, he hasn't been able to push Hornibrook the last couple of years, and I think obviously Hornibrook had the competition with Bart Houston as his freshman year, his redshirt freshman year. The last couple of years, he's been the guy, and he's been unquestionably the guy. And I think that not to say that I'm not saying he's taking that for granted or that he's going to work harder if somebody's pushing him, but I think it just a lot of times brings out sort of a different urgency, a different level in somebody naturally when they are kind of pushed to the limit and have someone on their heels. So it might be good for him too to have that. Maybe that brings out more in him as a senior if he does ultimately, if he ultimately is the starter again next year, and maybe he can have a better year. And then Rockwist711's last question was, do they realize Minnesota and Nebraska are coming, and if Braum stays, so is Purdue? What are they doing to prepare? That's a good point. It's kind of looking like Braum probably won't stay at this point. We'll have to see how that plays out. But and I do think Nebraska's coming. I think Scott Frost is going to be successful there. Obviously, they really had a good end of the season. They really started to pick it up there and win some games maybe you wouldn't expect them to down the stretch. Played Ohio State close, beat Michigan State, played Iowa close there last week. So I think they're going to be a lot better next year, and they're going to be a challenge for Wisconsin. Minnesota, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, they ended the season well here, beating Purdue and Wisconsin 2 of the last 3 weeks. Whether they're really going to be a challenger in the West or not, I think that's a wait and see. Maybe they can continue to turn that around. I think obviously it's a really good sign that they finished the season strong and got to bowl eligibility with such a young team. It's going to be interesting to see where they go. But I think the only way you can prepare for that is just to put the best team out there you can. Sort of like an earlier question about how they're going to deal with the tough schedule next year. I mean, there's nothing you can do. You can't change the schedule. You can't change what other teams are doing outside of, I guess, winning recruiting battles against them. But you just have to. I think you have to. I think the best way to do that is to bounce back and win the West next year. If you're able to reestablish yourself as the top team in the West, and look, it's not going to be easy when you have those crossover games like was mentioned earlier against Ohio State and Michigan and Michigan State. If you get losses against Michigan and Ohio State and another team that you're competing with in the West doesn't have those type of crossover games, that you're behind the 8 ball. But I think you just have to put out the best team you can and do everything you can to win the West, because I think if you're able to reestablish yourself as the top team in the West next year, you look at that and say, well, they're back on top. They've still won the West. What is it? What would it be then? 4 of the last 6 years, if that were to happen. I think that really helps the perception that you're still kind of on top of that division. But if you have another bad season, that makes gives those other teams a lot more confidence that they can keep it up, and you're just sort of part of a group then. So again, you just got to put the best team out, do the best you can to kind of bounce back and go from there. But there's nothing you can do about what other teams are doing, and nothing you can do about the schedule at this point. So again, you just have to put the best team out you can. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of the Red Zone. Thank you guys for all the questions. This is going to be our last episode for a couple weeks here. I think we'll probably come back in a couple weeks before the bowl game, do a couple leading up to the bowl game. But again, so we're going to find out where they go bowling on Sunday here. So make sure you visit madison.com for kind of a story on that when it comes up. Again, we got stories up on the all Big Ten teams as well. So make sure you check those out. And of course, follow me on Twitter at Jason_Galloway. And if you have not yet, subscribe to the Red Zone on iTunes or Google Play. Thanks for listening.